Hello, I am Anawiltus, and today I am going to be contrasting the regulative principle of worship and the normative principle of worship, and I'm going to give my opinion on those two things. So, relating to what's been happening with the channel, though recently I have been sick, I am getting better, and the next video after this one should be a good old free civ video. So anyway, let's get right back into the issue of things. So, what is the regulative principle of worship and what is the normative principle of worship? Now, I took some time to look these things up just to make sure that I was correct, and I looked at different sources, but I decided that for the purpose of this video, I'm going to be reading off of Wikipedia, one reason being because the copyright issues aren't as bad with Wikipedia. So anyway, here we go. The regulative principle of worship is a Christian doctrine held by some Calvinists and Anabaptists, although I would like to add to that, not necessarily exclusively or inclusively, that God commands churches to conduct public services of worship using certain distinct elements affirmatively found in Scripture, and conversely that God prohibits any and all practices in public worship. All other practices in public worship, to be exact. The doctrine further determines these affirmed elements to be those set forth in Scripture by express commands or examples, or, if not expressed, those which are implied logically by good and necessary consequence. The regulative principle thus provides a governing concept of worship as obedience to God identifies the set of specific practical elements constituting obedient worship and identifies and excludes disobedient practices. The regulative principle of worship is held, practiced, and vigorously maintained by conservative Reformed churches, the Restoration Movement, and other conservative Protestant denominations. Historic confessional standards stating the doctrine include the Westminster Confession of Faith, the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, and the London Baptist Confession of Faith. The regulative principle contrasts with the normative principle of worship, which teaches that whatever is not prohibited by Scripture is permitted in worship as long as it is agreeable to the peace and unity of the Church. In short, there must be agreement with the general practice of the Church, and no prohibition in Scripture for whatever is done in worship. The normative principle of worship is the generally accepted approach to worship practiced by Anglicans, Lutherans, Evangelicals, and Methodists. Although it is important to note that in the Wikipedia article here, it does put a citation needed on this one. A broader sense of the term regulative principle is occasionally cited on matters other than worship, for example, to constrain designs of church government to scriptural elements. When applied broadly, the term becomes indistinct from the principle of sola scriptura. So anyway, what is it then? It is the idea that there are certain things that should be in worship and certain functions that a church should, of course, by necessity accomplish. Meanwhile, that there are things outside of that scope that therefore should not be accomplished and should not be a part of worship. In addition to that, the normative principle means that there are those same things that should be accomplished in worship, the same church functions, but there are things outside of which to a broad degree, as long as they aren't sinful or as long as no one seriously objects, are things that are okay to have in church. So where I would analyze the agreement between the 2 points is, number one, there are things, certain things in the Bible described that a church should accomplish, and that worship services should accomplish. Meanwhile, sin is something that obviously should not be done in the church, or anywhere for that matter. but the difference arises in the things outside of those things that are prescribed, and in between, with the prescribed and the proscribed, in between those, there are a number of different things. For example, a lot of people on the regulative side object to the use of musical instruments. Now, I'm not saying all of them. I'm saying that there is a sizable group of people that believe that if you're in a church service and someone starts playing a guitar or a piano or a drum, that person is doing something that really shouldn't be done there, even if you're maybe in the middle of singing a hymn or hymns themselves. Some regulative principle folks do object to hymns themselves. Some of them are people that only sing the psalms. And overall, my criticism of the regulative principle is that some of these people are very uptight to an absurd degree, and I personally would argue that public services of worship using certain distinct elements affirmatively found in Scripture are not always necessarily going to be the exact same each time, because, believe it or not, the Bible doesn't actually give an outline to how exactly a public service should be structured. Although there are certain functions that a church should accomplish that are written in Scripture, that a congregation should accomplish, those functions are important. Scripture itself, to the best of my knowledge, doesn't necessitate that all these things are accomplished at the same time during a public service of worship, or that these things should necessarily be accomplished in a certain specific order. That's not saying that these things shouldn't be accomplished. That is saying that these things should definitely be accomplished, but that the express order or contemporaneity of these things is not expressed in Scripture, nor is it expressed that there are that these things are the only thing that a church should, that the congregations that form the church should accomplish in a public service of worship, to the exclusion of every other possible thing. On the other hand, my criticism of the normative principle of worship is that it can definitely be a slippery slope, that there is such a thing as discernment, that if you decide, just because something is allowed for you to do doesn't mean that it is something that you should do. Just because something is allowed for you to do and everyone agrees that it is something that everyone would enjoy doing also doesn't mean that it is something that you should do. So personally, my where I come down on this is that the things that are necessary in a church service, of course, the services that a congregation does that are necessary according to Scripture should always be there, regardless of where you stand on the issue. In addition to that, the question as to what sorts of things can or cannot be added, in my opinion, it should be judged based on how these things interact with the essential elements, the priorities. That is to say, that you can classify these things as positive or negative. Positive would be something that aids you in accomplishing these priorities, and something that overall makes the prioritative principles, the prioritive principle of worship, that's what I'm going to call this, they make these things better to accomplish. For example, not it. Let's say, let me think. I'm trying to think of something here, something specific. Okay, the use of a PowerPoint presentation by a preacher in order to visualize a point that the preacher is trying to make. That is something that is not described in the Bible, but that is also something that I would say, as long as it does not distract, detract, or in another way divert from the preaching and or any other of the essential principles, that it can be a good thing. On the other hand, the negative side of things would be things that distract, divert, or detract from accomplishing the the priorities. That is to say, for example, if you have if you decide that you really like to have rock music and you have rock music blaring during a sermon and it's distracting people from listening to what the preacher is trying to say, that obviously is something that you shouldn't have, even though it's something that isn't sinful in itself. Even if people do enjoy the music, if it's distracting people, if it's diverting from the actual point that people are there, if it is detracting from the message that is being given, then it obviously shouldn't be there. So therefore, I have come up with my own response, the prioritive principle of worship. That is to say that you take the essentials and you put them as priorities, and everything else has to be judged individually on whether it either helps you accomplish the priorities or inhibits you from accomplishing the priorities. And therefore, I reject the idea that this huge group of things can be collectively classified all in one side or all in the other side, all the adiaphora. I think that these things are things that need to be judged individually, and each needs to be ascertained whether they are benefiting or whether they are a benefit or a detriment according to their own merit. So that's my idea on this. Now, I know that there's a lot of people that are going to disagree with me on that, but in the comments section, if you disagree, I would like to hear your opinion. Maybe you know things better than I do. Maybe I'm just not that smart. I don't know. Or maybe you agree. Maybe you have a different perspective that you think would help other people understand. Maybe the way I've been doing this video has been very inconsistent and you'd like me to do a remake so that I can very clearly present the information that I'm trying to present. Or maybe you just want to comment. Maybe you just want to say hi, hello, how are you doing? I don't know. Whatever works for you. Just get writing in those comment sections. So anyway, thank you all for listening. Hopefully this has been mildly insightful. Hopefully my opinion has not been too off the wall. So anyway, thank you all, and I guess I will be seeing you next time. And Wiltos over and out.